Hey, it's Nick Schade and it's Tool Talk time. I want to talk about some of the tools I use for building strip-built boats. So understand that I'm talking about these tools in the context of the way I use them building strip-built boats. Here we have a bunch of scrapers of various sorts. Mainly paint scrapers, but I'm not using them as paint scrapers typically. What I'm using these for is scraping the surface of a strip-built boat to remove glue and to do the initial shaping. So I use these on the outside of the boat to remove glue drips and to start taking down the corner between two strips. And then when I'm on the inside, I found paint scrapers like this to be the most effective way to do the initial shaping prior to sanding. So this was probably my first paint scraper. It's fairly ubiquitous. Lots of people have paint scrapers like this, and it's not a bad system. It's got a stamped sheet metal blade here that can be unscrewed and rotated around, so you have essentially 4 different blades you can use. And this was probably my first experience with using a scraper to work on a strip-built boat, and I was very happy with it. It worked quite effectively. You can see I've shaped the blade, one of the blades here, to be a real curve. Some of them are straighter. So I have a bunch of different profiles here. There's a straight one, a curved one. This one back here is straight. This one's curved. And I just did that with a file. So I was quite happy with that paint scraper. So just a brief description about how I use these paint scrapers. I have them really sharp and I'm just pulling them down the length of the boat and peeling off the glue and starting to shave away at the surface of the wood a little bit. It's the same motion you'd use for a scraping paint, but I'm not scraping paint. You know, the glue is sort of the analogy to paint here. If you have a tool like this, really sharp, it'll pull nice clean shavings off the surface of the wood and do actually quite a nice job. Not as smooth as a plane, but it'll remove a nice curl of wood and do a nice job of starting to shape the boat. From there, I think I found this paint scraper. Again, just available at the local hardware store. I think this is a Schade. This is an All-Way Tools. And this worked pretty well also. Again, I could change the contours. This was a perfect triangle when I bought it. I put a nice curve on it, have a tight radius at this side, 2 fairly flat edges. Again, worked pretty nice. About the same time I was starting with this scraper, I was introduced to these Pro Prep scrapers. The sort of standard blade for these is something like that, sort of a chisel blade. But you could get a bunch of different blades and they were interchangeable. Nice curved blade, and you just undo some screws and you swap them out. So I had a bunch of these different blades. These, again, worked really nice. Really good steel on here, stainless steel, and I was really happy with these scrapers. Worked really well. As I started using the scrapers more frequently, I found some limitations. These tend to chatter a fair amount. The thin metal on them just makes it so it vibrates a lot as you're pulling it down the boat. It would tend to sort of gouge it by just sort of like washboarding down the length of the boat. It would hit something and the chatter would just make it bounce up and down, and it dig gouges down the length of the boat. And this also, fairly thin material on the blade, and I just found it chattered a lot. So I started looking around, and some of the woodworking stores had what they called shave hooks, which are basically just another name for a paint scraper. And I found this one at a woodworking store. And you'll notice this one I actually use for scraping paint. I don't think it's good for much else. Again, that flexibility problem. It's a fairly thin blade out on the end of a fairly small diameter shaft, and it just flexed all over the place. This flat edge is out at the end of a skinny piece, so the flat edge there is out at the end, and this end just wants to vibrate and flex. And then at the woodworking store I found another one which had a blade like this. Unfortunately, the handle was wood, but this blade is an 1/8 inch thick. So this blade's about 3/32. This one, it's less than a 1/16. These ones are not bad, but you know, it's less than an 1/8, and since it's tapered down at the ends there, out here it's really quite flexible and thin. These tended to vibrate, but I found this one, but it was attached to a wooden handle and threaded. Basically there was an insert going into the end grain of a wooden handle, and that failed almost immediately. But I had this tool. I swapped it out. This was originally square, but I've again modified the shape a lot to serve my needs, and I even have a place here for rounding over stuff. I used that on the combing just the other day. And I found this big beefy shaft on it, big thick blade, tighten this up really well, and this did a really nice job. Pulled these beautiful shavings off, and just I was really happy with the way this worked, and I made a lot of boats with this. Eventually, I think looking on Amazon, I saw these scrapers. I think it was probably this triangular one, and it was being offered by a company called the Silent Paint Remover. Basically, they're selling some infrared gizzy that heats up paint on the exterior of houses, so it makes it easier to peel it off. But I didn't care about that thing. I cared about these scrapers, so I bought one. And again, blade on this, good 1/8 inch thick, really good steel. And I bought one of these. Even though it has a fairly small diameter shaft, but somehow the long handle on this and the shorter shaft up here, I was really able to get good results with this. And it took a really nice edge. I could put an edge on here that would peel these beautiful shavings. I really like these tools. Again, I got them from this company that makes a silent paint remover, and there's the links below. But let me tell you a little bit more about some of my choices. This is another fairly ubiquitous tool. It's got a carbide edge, which sounds great. It sounds like it'll hold its edge for a long time, and I think it does. But what I found is it's just not all that sharp to begin with. It doesn't get dull, it just was never all that sharp. And I have a smaller one, just a little triangular blade on it. And I end up using these quite a bit, but I find there's different uses for them. Unfortunately, these Pro Prep scrapers are no longer made. I assume the business went under and it's no longer around. And at the hardware store where these used to hang, I found this, which looked like a decent tool made by Alway, the same company that makes this, and it came with a whole little wallet full of different blades. Seemed like it ought to be great, you know, sort of a good replacement for the Pro Prep. But right out of the bat, these blades, they got a ragged edge on them. I don't know if it'll show up in there, but the edge on this is super ragged. Just, it needed a lot of love to do anything. So I've never even used some of these because they're just in such bad shape. Some of these I've worked on a little bit. The sort of cool thing about this, it comes with a little file in it so you can sharpen the blades up. Well, that's kind of nice. Held in there with a magnet. It's kind of a sweet little idea, but it just wasn't working for me. It doesn't take a great edge. The mechanism for holding it in place is not really secure enough to keep it from vibrating. So I end up not using that. These Pro Prep, again, if you find some of these, they're a very useful tool. I don't use them that much for scraping the body of the boat, but this little one, which also they had a narrower handle. This little narrow one is really great for getting up in the ends of the boat. Basically that last ½ inch where the narrowest one of these just doesn't reach. So these are no longer really available, but like I said, if you do find these in the hardware store, there might still be some hanging on a rack someplace. Pick them up, they're useful. Pro Prep. I wouldn't bother with these cheap ones at the woodworking store. These are not bad. They actually work pretty well. They're really easy to put an edge back on. This is probably the easiest one to find, and it'll do a good job. You can probably find this at basically any hardware store, big box store, whatever. These are a little bit better, a little bit harder to find, but still somewhat available. I find this on Amazon. I believe it's made by Schade, and Schade's fairly common in hardware stores. If your local hardware store doesn't have this, they may actually be able to order it for you if they stock Schade products. These with the carbide blade are not bad. I don't use them for scraping the outside of the boat. Again, for scraping epoxy, they work quite well, or the fiberglass. And that's where I end up using the Pro Preps the most, is scraping fiberglass and epoxy. If you have a long drool or drip, you don't want to try and sand that down because you'll tend to sand around the drip. You can scrape off the top of the drip and it works like a charm. So these carbide, that's the kind of use I use them for, is scraping the fiberglass and epoxy. I often get asked, can I use a cabinet scraper? And I think you probably can. I don't end up finding them that useful on the softwood. These are good for fine finishes on hardwoods. You put a good edge on there, it'll do a nice job. And again, scraping epoxy drips, these work very well. They're not really intended for softwood removing material. Not that these are either, but these do a great job at it. So as you see, I ended up with quite a selection of these, and they are available in a bunch of different blade types. I thought, okay, I hit a home run when I got this big square one. I modified this again on my bench grinder to put some radiuses on there, different sizes. But I found just the large size of this, again, it starts to chatter. It's flexible enough and there's enough leverage on it that it will start to chatter. Nice idea. I'm going to keep this around. I'll probably grind it smaller. I can make custom shapes on it. What I end up using the most are these three. This triangle, again, it was more triangular and had a couple different contours on it. I end up on the bench grinder just shaping this down to this, so I have sort of a flat edge, a large diameter, another flat edge, a small diameter, some other little diameters on it. For getting into narrow places and tighter radiuses, I've got this so that you can think of it kind of like a French curve. You can choose the part of it that has the curve that you want. Works nicely, and again, getting down into the ends, this will go farther into the ends than the bigger blade will. If I have to choose one of these, I'd probably get this, which I think the Silent Paint Remover company calls this like the German shingle or German clapboard or something, I'm not sure. This is pretty close to the stock shape. It's got a fairly wide flat area, two radiuses, and then another flat area. And this gets into a variety of shapes quite well. That radius turns out to be a pretty good radius for a lot of the stuff I do, but having a set of different ones comes in handy. These big paint scrapers have become my go-to tool for the initial scraping of the wood after I'm done stripping and I have glue all over everything. You don't really want to sand or plane glue. It'll gum up the sandpaper, gum up your plane. These scrapers don't get gummed up that way. And then for the initial shaping, if you have them really nice and sharp, and so I take them either with a single cut bastard file or take them to my bench grinder. You can even take them to a belt sander. You can put a really fine edge on us, and I'll even take a diamond stone to it to really get a super sharp edge on that. So I'll get them close with the file or the grinder, then take a little small diamond stone to get in there and really hone that edge to a razor sharp. And when it's razor sharp, here's the waterline accent strip glued together with the red cedar on either side, and it peels that right up in a nice curl. These have been a game changer for me on the inside of the boat particularly. I always struggled with finding something that would do a good job on the shaping of the inside. The best thing before this that I had was 40 grit sandpaper on a foam block, which I still use the foam block. It's after the scraping, that's a good tool, but this is much quicker and much more efficient. You know, it's not a fine finish, but it's level, smooth, and does a great job. So the procedure with these is I place them down on the surface of the boat, hold the handle low to the surface of the boat, hold the blade just with a couple fingers. I'm not putting pressure on that. I'm just sort of helping damp out any chatter it might have, any tendency for it to jump up. And then a quick sharp pull. It's not slow pulling, even though if it's nice and sharp, it'll make a nice cut. I find it works best if you do a quick pull as opposed to a slow pull. If you do a slow pull, it tends to ride along the surface of the boat and doesn't fair things out, where a quick pull, just momentum, will tend to shave off the high spots more than the low spots and leave a really nice finish when it's done. I know a lot of people struggle finishing the inside of their canoes and kayaks and other boats when they're strip building. It can be a lot of work. You know, you could go in with a right angle grinder, a disc sander, but you have to be awfully darn good with it to not ruin the boat. Where with these scrapers, it's not impossible to screw it up. You absolutely can get chatter, and you can get tear out and chips and chunks ripped out, but if you get it sharp and practice with it, you'll have much better results than any tool I've found so far. So these are my paint scrapers. Some people may call them shave hooks. They're really good tools. Here's the All-Way Tools sheet metal paint scraper. Makes a pretty good shaving. Here's the Schade with its original blade. A little bit better. Here's the one from Silent Paint Remover, which, by the way, the brand name that makes it is Anza. It's a Swedish company. So nice shavings there too. So, you know, any one of these three is going to do a fine job in the end. Like I say, these thinner blades tend to chatter a little bit more, but not a big deal. I have not looked at prices of these at this point. I suspect these are the most expensive. They're definitely the hardest to come by. These, I know there's something like this on Amazon. These are pretty ubiquitous at any hardware store or big box store. Should be pretty easily available. And again, the key to any of these working well is putting a sharp edge on it.